Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I'm here with Joshua Sijuwade. We're going to be talking about transubstantiation. And so Joshua recently shared a paper with me that's going to be published, I believe, in the Journal of Analytic Theology. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Yeah.
So Joshua, thanks for coming out to my show. I'm really excited to have you on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Swan. I'm really privileged to be on. Your content's great. I really enjoy it. And I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I have to confess to you, Joshua. I read through the paper one time, right? And I was thinking to myself, like, in this day and age where we can actually sit down and talk to, over Zoom, the people who wrote these papers, it's like it'd be if I had Aristotle here to help me work through physics or something like that, So I'm really gifted to have your presence here today.
Thank you.
So Joshua, here's my kind of opening question, right? So I have to confess, I used to think that you were high church Anglican, and the reason why is because you mentioned Richard Swinburne. I know Richard Swinburne became Orthodox, but like before, British, right? Analytic tradition. So typically, people who are analytic tend to kind of have, I guess, an aversion towards or away from kind of classical thought, right? And so I thought, like, okay, yeah, but Josh was a solid guy, and then I found out you were Catholic, and I got so excited. So can you talk a little bit about your journey to Catholicism?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a long journey, but one that is, it took a bit of time to get where I am now. But it's been a very just enriching journey, I'll say. So I was brought up in a Christian environment. So when I was younger, I was sort of brought up in a Christian home. And my mum was taking me to church regularly. So I was sort of surrounded by sort of Christian friends, a Christian environment. I went to a Christian secondary or high school. So Christianity was sort of there and available for me, but it didn't really mean much to me at all. I didn't really care anything about it. It was that sort of kicking and screaming, going to church sort of feeling that you might have had, or some people might have had in the past. And so I was sort of being forced into Christianity at that point, and I sort of just had the rejection in my mind in a way that I was more inclined towards other things. I was really into playing sports and sort of that, that the sort of people fall into like the nightclub life and those sort of things when I was about 18. So that was my disposition. So you can see it's very different from the upbringing that I had. And that's where I sort of was inclined towards. I wanted to play sports, I wanted to have fun, and I couldn't really care less about theological matters or things about God. But it wasn't until I was 19 years old, and I had an experience that completely changed my life. So I had a religious experience where it was one night where I just believed that God was speaking to me. I heard this voice, an audible voice, and I heard this voice say to me that, Josh, if you were to pass away tonight, you would not be with me. And that voice was just repeating itself, and it was just sort of just repeating itself in my mind. And I felt like it was piercing my heart. And literally just off of those few sentences, my whole life changed. And from that experience, hearing that voice, all of my inclinations towards sin and other things was just completely changed. And I was now inclined fully towards just wanting to know more about God. And so I sought to be baptized, and I felt that God's grace was infused within my heart. And my life was just completely changed. I now had a disposition towards Christianity. And I felt that I wanted also to know more theologically about God. So I felt I wanted to devote my life to this in an academic context. And so the American football, which was sort of the main sort of desires at that time to go and play American football, go to America and do all those sort of things, was sort of fizzling out. And I still love American football, but I wasn't thinking that was my vocation. My vocation was to serve the kingdom of God. And I felt it was more in a theological academic setting. And so that's what I did. I decided to go to a place called London School of Theology in London, and got my bachelor's degree in theology. And then when I was there, I sort of fell into apologetics. It was actually from watching, I really just found out about the whole field of apologetics, and then later on philosophy of religion, was from watching a debate between William Lane Craig and Christopher Hitchens. That debate completely changed my view of the rationality of Christianity. I just felt like, oh my gosh, you can actually put forward a rational case for this belief. And so I sort of started realizing that actually it wasn't, this experience was the thing that changed my life, but there's also a rational grounding to the faith that I was now given by God. And so I just fell into apologetics, and then from apologetics I found people like Alvin Plantinga, who I wrote my my bachelor's dissertation on, and then Richard Swinburne as well during that time, who I just felt I really wanted to know more about his work. And so I then said I want to go into further academic studies. So I decided to go and get a postgraduate degree in master's in philosophy of religion. And then also I wanted to go into to further sort of academic teaching. So I decided to go and get a PhD. And so I focused then on the work of Richard Swinburne, and his sort of work has been very, very influential, just not even just mentally and theologically, but also spiritually. I just felt that his work, even though it can be dry analytic philosophy, it just felt just like, right, this is the way to do theology, and it really has transformed my thinking. And so then from that, actually reading Swinburne's work made me start reflecting on, why am I the type of Christian that I am? Because I was sort of, I just absorbed the Christianity of my family, which was Protestant, evangelical, Pentecostalism. And so I just that's what I was. And then I started thinking through specifically Swinburne's book Revelation, where he was putting forward a case for the need for a church, an authoritative structure that would accompany God's propositional revelation. And so he doesn't in that book state that it has to be the Orthodox or Catholic Church, even though, like, personal conversation with him, he obviously was saying, that book was inclined towards orthodoxy, but he was just saying generally there needs to be some form of authoritative structure if we're going to correctly interpret God's propositional revelation. And just through wrestling through that book, that made me start thinking, why am I Protestant? And I just started delving deeper into sort of the debate between Protestants, Orthodox, and Catholics. And it was for the past 3-4 years before I got received into the church 2 years ago, it was a battle in my mind, which form of Christianity is correct. And I just felt, after 12 rounds of boxing, I would say really between Orthodox and Catholic, which was the main issue between me, I just felt Catholicism was the one that won out, just because of the ecclesiastical authoritative structure that's given to us by the church. And I think that's needed if we're going to have epistemic certainty about doctrine and other issues like that. Yeah.
Joshua, can I guess who your confirmation saint is?
You can guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
Saint Augustine.
What do you think it is? No, it isn't actually.
Oh, okay, okay.
No. It is. I think a lot of philosophers just say, I picked Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. That's mine.
Yeah. So it is Thomas. Even though my work, I mean, he's a great influence in my life, even though I haven't interacted so much with a lot of his work in my own writings. Just the way for me, the way that he has done philosophy of religion is the way that we should be doing it. And I just felt his disposition is what I want to have towards my philosophical study, where you have loyalty to the magisterium and the revelation that God has given us. But you can also have freedom to think philosophically about issues and use the best philosophy of the time, which he used with his Aristotelianism, and sort of I'm trying to do with this analytic sort of metaphysics and stuff. And it's just sort of the same attitude that Saint Thomas Aquinas had, is what I felt I want to embody as well. Yeah,
and just before we get to your presentation on transubstantiation,
yes,
would you say then that Swinburne was your kind of entrance into analytic philosophy and theology, or was there any other influence that kind of really made you adopt that tradition and articulate your arguments through that form?
Yeah, so definitely Swinburne and Plantinga. So those sort of two. So I was very hot on Reformed epistemology when I was in my undergraduate. So that's why I did my dissertation on that. I felt it was amazing. And Plantinga is a great writer. He's also very funny when he writes sometimes. So I really loved reading his stuff. So he influenced me. But then I would say generally it's always been Swinburne. So I'm talking like 7 years of really like wrestling with a lot of his stuff. I felt that's how I want to do philosophy of religion, because he like, similar to what I was saying with Aquinas, if you read his works, he takes the best philosophy that you can think, sort of general philosophy, and says, actually, we don't need to be scared of philosophy as some, theistic believers are. They're saying, oh no, philosophy is not very helpful. Actually, we can take our best philosophy and we can show that utilizing our best philosophy, we can provide a robust justification, clarification of theistic claims. And that's sort of, Swinburne's writings and all those sort of things have really, I would say they're the main influence that I had when I was sort of going into analytic sort of writing stuff. And but Plantinga as well played a big role, I would say, at the beginning. Yeah.
All right, Joshua, take it away.
That's great. Okay, so let me just share my screen.
Also, while you get your presentation up,
Yes.
somebody
Yes.
actually, I forgot who it was exactly, but he said that he loved the way that you had explained transubstantiation. And when I told him that I was going to have you on my show, he almost lost his mind. And so you
Oh,
definitely
okay.
have fans, Joshua,
Oh,
on this
that's great.
topic.
Great.
Mhm.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It is yeah, this the paper itself is like with all my papers, they're super long. So I do thank a lot of people who actually get through them. But yeah, I'm just sort of trying to get my way through these doctrines in a manner that I can utilize, some of this contemporary metaphysics that a lot of general philosophers are utilizing in a general context, and trying to apply them within these theological contexts to clarify sometimes these let's say intellectually challenging doctrines. And I would say transubstantiation is one of them. So yeah, so just with my presentation, please, Swan, anytime do stop me, because I can go on for like 1,000 years just talking like I'm talking to myself, forgetting people are actually listening. So please stop me if there's any clarification needed. This one I would say is quite conceptually complex, but I will break down a lot of the terms because I'm using some ontology and certain things that might be a little bit difficult, but I will break them down as we're going through. But please do stop me anytime for questions, and I will stop as well to ask if you need.
I'll use the raise hand function on Zoom.
Awesome.
How about that?
Okay, do that. Yeah. If not, just shout out, please stop, because I might not notice. I get too engrossed in this stuff. Okay, awesome. So yeah, my paper was titled Transubstantiation, a Metaphysical Proposal. So I'm literally trying to do that. I'm trying to provide a metaphysical proposal for how we can best understand the doctrine of transubstantiation. So the way that I'm sort of just going to approach this is by stating the general doctrine, what I would say has been given to us by the church, and then trying to apply certain metaphysical concepts and ideas to the doctrine to help clarify it, to say actually how we can understand it best. And that will be in the context of dealing with something called the intelligibility problem or question, which was the main thing that I was focusing on in the paper. So yeah, so just generally, we can have a simple statement of the doctrine. So let's say we have the doctrine saying this certain thing, the doctrine of transubstantiation, which I would say is a specification of the general doctrine of the real presence, which is just the idea that Christ is literally present in the Eucharistic element. So his body and blood is literally present in the bread and the wine. So when we're saying that, just calling it the doctrine of transubstantiation, we can say then at the moment of consecration, the Eucharistic element. So I'm using the term Eucharistic element just to refer to whatever entity is that we're referring to that is transforming into the body and blood of Christ. So you can refer to it in different ways, but I'm just using the term Eucharistic element to refer to this thing. So at the moment of consecration, the Eucharistic element is transformed into the body and blood of Christ. But specifically, it's a substance. So the substance of bread and wine of the Eucharistic element is transformed into Jesus Christ's body, blood, and it's also added soul and divinity. So we have, at this moment of consecration, this element that we're referring to, which prior to the act of consecration is bread and wine, is then transformed substantially into Christ's body and blood. That's sort of, I would say, the simple statement of the doctrine. Now, I'm also going to use certain terms, so terms like the host, and that will just be referring to the element in its post-consecrated state, so the host, and that is just basically saying it is Jesus Christ. So that will be the terminology that I'm using. And then just sort of for the listeners that might be thinking why they should even interact with this idea that does seem conceptually difficult, why should we hold to it? Well, there are certain sources of authority that lead us to this position. And you can have other verses. So John would be another important book in the Bible that would refer to this. But one of the key ones that we see is when the Eucharist is first spoken about, really, we would say, in this specific fashion that we should then follow on. And what we have, this institution of the Eucharist, is where Christ states in Luke 22:19 that he took the bread, gave thanks and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And in the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." So the key thing there is the reference where Christ is saying, "This is my body." And then we also see in John, in another verse, where he's saying we need to eat the flesh and drink the blood of Christ. And so what we seem to have there is a literal statement that there is a consumption of Christ in the Eucharist. It's not bread and wine that we're consuming. We're actually eating the body and drinking the blood of Christ. But then we also have, this will be for obviously your Catholic listeners, which will see this as being authoritative. We have certain councils. So Fourth Lateran Council, we also have the Council of Trent, which states the doctrine when it says and defines it as a conversion is made of the whole substance of the bread into the substance of the body of Christ our Lord, and of the whole substance of the wine into the substance of his blood. So what we have here is a statement, a definitional statement that is saying there is a conversion that's made to the substance of the bread into the substance of Christ, his body. Then also there's a conversion made to the substance of wine into his blood as well. And so what we have here is that there is a conversion, a transformation of something. So when we are consuming the Eucharist after the moment of consecration, we are consuming the body and blood of Jesus Christ. And this is in a literal and real sense. It's not symbolic. And so just taking sort of that into account, we can then say in a more precise manner that this is a doctrine. So at the moment of consecration, Jesus Christ becomes substantially present in the Eucharistic element through the substance of bread being converted into his body and blood. So I'm just with that first one, I'm referring to bread here because I'll be using bread as the representative, but I'm also referring to the wine as well. But throughout the presentation, I'll just be referring to bread just because it's easier to state than always saying bread and wine. But what we have here is that there is a substantial presence of Christ in the Eucharistic element, where the substance of the bread is now converted into his body and blood. And so then after this conversion, the Eucharistic element continues to have sensible qualities of bread. So what we're seeing, if we were to put the Eucharist post-consecration under a microscope, we will be seeing qualities of bread. We won't be seeing qualities of bone and bone marrow and blood and all these sort of things. We'll be seeing sensible qualities of bread. But what that thing actually is, substantially, is Christ's body and blood. Sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you, Joshua. So I just had a question about, in your paper, you use sensible qualities, whereas, Aquinas would traditionally use accidents, and even the church, right, would use the talk of accidents and dimensive quantity. And so I was wondering, is sensible qualities kind of your substitution for those terms?
Yes, it is. It's just I felt it's easier to access than accidents.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just because accidents can, in philosophical sort of ways, can be understood in different manners.
Yeah.
So, for example, when I speak about simplicity, I might use the term accident, but I might not use it in the exact same way that I'm using it in this context. So I just felt sensible qualities gets across what we're trying to say, that with your senses, we're talking about our taste and our eyes and everything, our touch, we are feeling bread there. What we're sensing is bread. But what this thing is substantially is actually Christ. Yeah, so it's just sort of a substitution of it, but just so it's easier to access for individuals epistemically.
All right, thank you, Joshua. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Okay, so just last thing on this then, before we start moving on, is someone might be saying, well, why is this doctrine important? Why should I care about the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist and sort of the interpretation of it as transubstantiation? Well, why I would say, and why the church has said this and has declared this to be of great importance, is because the Eucharist is the source and summit of the Christian life. You can see this stated in the Catechism and other places, but it is the source and summit of the Christian life. And why it is that is because, number one, it allows us to have a tangible presence of Christ that's with us throughout all of our existence until his return, that we have Christ literally there with us. It could be every day if you go to mass, and that's amazing. And what we have is this tangible presence of Christ. He has not left us alone, but he is here with us in a physical manner. But also it is a way for us to have in a tangible physical manner, the infusion of grace, that we can actually not just, let's say, spiritually and all those sort of things, have grace given to us, which it is given to us, but there is a way for us to actually tangibly access God's grace. And then that results in the most important thing, I would say, that there is now union with God in Christ. And so we become part of his body by consuming him into our bodies. And so we become united with him. And so this doctrine is central in allowing us to have that, having the tangible presence of Christ, having grace infused within us, and then allowing us to be united with him and ultimately with God through Christ. Yeah, so that's for me the importance of the doctrine. And so with this in hand, saying that this is the doctrine, this idea that there is a transubstantiation, there is a transformation of the substance of bread into the substance of Christ's body and blood. And we also see that there are sources of authority that give us this as revealed doctrine. And we see it's important for us for our daily living as Christians. I would say then it's very important that we actually understand this so that we can communicate it effectively to others. And so this is then in the context of, I would say, an important issue that has been raised, I would probably say, throughout the life of this doctrine. But it was stated well in a question format by a person called Michael Dummett. And I've called this the intelligibility problem. It can be called other things. It's in the format of a question. But he states this, where he says, the primary philosophical question is, how is it possible to deny propositions that pass all the normal tests for truth? Namely, this is bread and wine, and affirm in their place propositions that pass none of these tests. This seems to be an utter mistake. So what we have him stating here is that it seems to be the case that philosophically, how do we make sense of this? Now, obviously, someone might be able to just reaffirm the doctrine and say, yes, of course, under our tests, we're going to see bread. But what we are trying to say is that this is not bread, it is the body of Christ. And so our tests are obviously going to say, no, it is bread. But if we are trying to understand this better, and we're trying to say, how can we have this central doctrine that is important for our Christian living, how can we effectively affirm it, mentally assent to it, and communicate it if we do not understand, to some level, the working of it? So what I would say is that there should be some form of an apprehension of the doctrine. How can we make sense of it? And so we should be able to render it in some manner as intelligible, that this is the way that it could be so. So what I'm trying to do then with this sort of proposal that I'm putting forward is trying to answer this question. I'm trying to answer the question of, I called it now the intelligibility question. What ontologically does it mean for Jesus Christ to be substantially present within the Eucharistic element and for the element solely to appear to be bread? So what does it mean? What are we saying when we say this ontologically? Because it's fine for us just to reassert the doctrine and say, well, there's a transformation or change in the substance of the bread into the substance of Christ's body. How is that so? Because normally when things change, we should also see some form of change. But what we're also reaffirming here is that there is something remaining. There are the sensible qualities. And so someone would say, well, how can we make sense of this? How is this intelligible? And so what I'm trying to say is that there is a way that we can, a possible way to make sense of this through utilizing a certain metaphysical framework. And so what I'm trying to do is put forward an account that I've termed the Neo-Aristotelian account, which tries to provide an answer to this intelligibility question. This is what it could be ontologically. Not saying that this is how it has to be, but the way that a lot of philosophers do, let's say in philosophy religion, is that they'll put forward logically consistent, possible, or metaphysically possible models to say, this is how it could be so. It doesn't have to necessarily be like this, but this is a way to make sense of it. And so we can latch onto this in our communication and in our beliefs about it. And so that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to put forward this account to answer and say, this is how it could be ontologically, how we can make sense of this specific doctrine. And this is utilizing a very famous metaphysician who really unfortunately passed away very young. So E.J. Lowe, or Jonathan Lowe, some people call him. He had a very robust metaphysical framework, which I believe can be translated and utilized very fruitfully in theological context. And I've done this in other work with the Trinity and other things, but I've also utilized some of his concepts here to make sense of this doctrine. So specifically, I'm utilizing his metaphysical framework called serious essentialism, and then more importantly, his 4-category ontology. And so I believe by utilizing some of the notions within this metaphysical framework given to us by Lowe, we can then render this doctrine in a clear and intelligible manner that can then be effectively communicated. I don't know if that's fine, that's one, if you have any questions, or I can just sort of still shoot on.
Yeah, or just one question real quick. So when I
Yes.
read Michael Dummett's quote the first time, I interpreted it as kind of being an epistemic question, right? And so passing on the normal test for truths, I guess that would be, like an epistemic thing, like, given our sensory experience and what have you. So I interpreted that as epistemic, right? Whereas I think you're answering the ontological question. And so I'm interested in just what you see the connection between the intelligibility question and Dummett's intelligibility problem being.
Yes. So I would say I think they're dependent upon each other.
Sure.
So by answering the ontological question, you will then have an answer to the epistemic question. Because by saying, well, this is what it is ontologically, you can then say, well, this is how you can believe it to be the case. This is how you can have an intelligible understanding of the specific doctrine. So I'm trying to say, actually, the root problem is, what is the ontology going on here? Like,
Right.
what's happening? What's changing? What is the change? How can we understand the transformation that takes place here? And so then by answering that, we can then say, well, this is how to best understand it. So then that's to do with our mental assent to the doctrine. So I think, yeah, maybe the way that he might have stated it, I would agree with you, is epistemically. But I think by tackling the more harder ontological question, you then sort of get the epistemic question answered as well for free. That's sort of
All
the
right.
way.
Sounds great.
Awesome. Okay, so then moving on. Just warning some of the listeners, this will get quite deep quite quickly. So do hang on, and hopefully I can clarify all these points. Okay, so firstly, there are two parts to my account. There is the account utilizing the essentialism of Lowe, and then there's the second part of the account is utilizing his ontological framework. And I think that they're needed to utilize both of these parts to make sense of the model that I'm trying to put forward. So Lowe is utilizing something called essentialism, which is a general metaphysical view that just holds to a certain range of entities having essences. Generally, Lowe and others will say all entities that exist have an essence. Now, the question is then, what do we mean by the term essence? Now, there are some philosophers who are not essentialists, so they would not utilize the notion of an essence. But people like Lowe, Neo-Aristotelians like him, Kit Fine, Catherine Kostelicki, they would say, no, all entities have essences. So we need to understand what an essence is. Well, Lowe draws a distinction between two forms of essentialism. There is serious essentialism, which is his own view, and then there is something called ersatz or modal essentialism, which I would say is the more prevalent view. So your listeners might have heard of people like Saul Kripke, Alvin Plantinga, Hilary Putnam. Those were individuals who played a massive role in breathing life again to metaphysics in the latter part of the 20th century. And they utilized the notion of essentialism. But modal essentialism is not what we're looking at, because it's just basically the idea that an essence is something that can be understood within modal categories. Something is essential to an entity if it's something that they must have in order to exist, and then the must being a modal category of necessity. So when we're talking about essentialism, we're not talking about that latter one. We're talking about what Lowe calls serious essentialism, which is more rooted in the work of Aristotle. So I will first just read the quote and then sort of define it. So what Lowe does with his serious essentialism, and other philosophers, like I've said, Kit Fine and others, they seek to follow Aristotle and to a greater extent, John Locke, in understanding an essence, as it's quoted there, as the very being of anything whereby it is what it is. Now, that might sound a bit strange, but the way we can then understand it with a more precise definition is the idea that an essence of an entity X is what X is, or what it is to be X as expressed by a real definition. So an essence of something is something which states what it is to be that thing. So if you point to something to say, well, what is that thing? Like at the bare bones level, what you're trying to refer to is the essence of that thing. And so it's nothing to do with modal categories, what a thing must have in order to exist. Now, obviously, Lowe would say the modal categories stem from this, but it's about priority. What's more important about essentialism and essences is trying to define what that entity is. That is what an essence should be doing. And so the key thing then related to an essence is the idea of a real definition. And so a real definition of an entity, now let's using the term E, a real definition of an entity E is understood as a proposition which tells us in the most perspicuous fashion what E is. So a real definition is telling us what that thing is, and it's trying to be as clear as possible and as accurate as possible. And so what we can do then, what we can understand is that a real definition plays a big part in Aristotle's own understanding of essence, and then in Kit Fine and now Jonathan Lowe's work, the real definition is very important. So if I want to know what something is, I'm going to try and understand what its real definition is. And so real definitions are then understood to be explanatory principles. And the normal way that we encounter them are through sort of locutions like to be. So to be X is to be Y. And so I'm going to just quickly run through then a few examples to help illustrate this, because examples always help to bring across philosophical notions. Okay, so just reading what some of the stuff now, I won't go through all of it. So let's say I wanted to know what the essence of gold is. Well, the essence of gold is what gold is, or what it is to be gold. That is what the essence is. And then how I epistemically understand it is by its real definition. So then I would see then to be gold is to be a metal whose atomic constituents have the atomic number 79. Now, there might be a more specific one than that, but someone could say that is what it is to be gold. And then let's say we go with Socrates. So to be Socrates, okay, that will be the real definition that we're looking at. But what I'm trying to capture by the real definition is what Socrates is, pointing to him and say, what is Socrates? What is it to be Socrates? Well, the real definition will then tell me what it is to be Socrates. And so to be Socrates is to be a rational animal who has sophroniscus and I never say her name right. Phanerati, I think that's it. Very, I would love to have that name. Phanerati. So let's go with that as his parents. So he has these two parents, and they are his, biological parents. And so they will play a part in his real definition. So if I want to know who Socrates is, firstly, I'll say he is a rational animal, and then he has these parents, and that's what individuates Socrates. And so again, just trying to understand an essence is what it is to be an entity, and then the real definition expresses that. So I'll then just go to one last one. I'll just go with, let's say, water. So if I want to know what water is, I'm trying to ask for its essence. And so that will be what water is, or what it is to be water. And so then I'll try and understand the real definition of water. So to be water is to be a quantity of a chemical substance composed predominantly of H2O molecules. So that will be the definition that expresses to me the essence of water. And so by that, I understand what it is to be water. Okay, and you can sort of have so many examples, but at the base level, what we're trying to understand is that the essence of an entity is something which provides an answer to a what question. So what metaphysical features does this entity have? That's what its essence would be. Okay, so just reiterating the point, what we're looking at with this sort of ontological view, metaphysical view, is something called essentialism, and it's serious essentialism, which is something that stems from Aristotle's work and also the work of John Locke. And Lowe sees this as being something which states what it is to be a specific entity. And the way that we can then epistemically access this is through the real definition of that entity. And that will take a certain structure, which we can then understand in a very specific fashion. Okay. And the last thing then is that an essence should be answering a what question. And that's quite key for what we're going to look at in a few minutes. So then let's say we take that metaphysical view on board. So this serious essentialism view. I then believe that we can now restate the doctrine of transubstantiation in a certain way. Okay, so we can understand it in a certain fashion. And so, as I stated it before, we are now adding to this definition, or a better way to say is that we're clarifying it within an essentialist structure. So what we can now understand the doctrine of transubstantiation to say within essentialism is the idea that at the moment of consecration, Jesus Christ is substantially present in the Eucharistic element by it ceasing to have an essence of bread and beginning to have an essence of a host. After this conversion, the Eucharistic element transforms from being bread to being a host. That is the body and blood of Christ, through there being a change to the essence of this particular entity. So the key thing here is that there is an essential change. There's a change to the essence of the Eucharistic element. That is what transubstantiation is being interpreted as here. So as I said before, all entities have essences. So that would include the Eucharistic element. It has an essence. So that is what the element is, or what it is to be that specific element. And then it's expressed by the real definition of it. And so the essence of the element states its identity. And that's for any entity as well. The essence of the entity expresses its identity, what it is. And so, as I was just saying then, what we have with the doctrine of transubstantiation interpreted in this way is the idea that at that specific moment of consecration, there is a change to the essence of the Eucharistic element. And so what we can see is a change that takes place in this way. So let's say we have this sort of structure again. We have the entity, the Eucharistic element, in its pre-consecrated state. And so what that would be then is that the essence of the Eucharistic element would be what bread is, or what it is to be bread. And then the real definition would be, to be sacramental bread is to be a food that is made of wheat flour and contains a certain quantity of water. So that expresses the bread that we're talking about there. And that's what it is in its pre-consecrated state. That's what its essence is. But then at the moment of consecration, what we then have is an essential change, a change to the essence of the Eucharistic element. And so what we now have post-consecration is a Eucharistic element. And then its essence now is what the host is, or what it is to be the host. And then expressed by the real definition, that will be now defining the Eucharistic element. We will say to be the host is to be the body and blood of Jesus Christ. So that's what the element is now in its post-consecrated state. And so sort of stating this more precisely, walking through this, because there was a lot of moves made there. So prior to the act of consecration, the Eucharistic element exists as bread, due to the fact that the essence of the element, as expressed by its real definition, specifies it as bread. That's what it is. It is just bread prior to the act of consecration. But then at the moment of consecration, there is a change to the essence of the Eucharistic element, such that it now exists as a host, due to the fact that the essence of the element, now expressed by its post-consecrated real definition, now specifies it as a host. So what we have is a transformation of the Eucharistic element from being one type of substance, one type of particular object, bread, to it now being another type of substance, another type of particular object, which is now the host. And how there is that change is because there is a change to what that thing is, a change to the identity of that specific thing. And so what it used to exist as, what it was identified as, was as bread. But then at the moment of consecration, it ceased to be bread, ceased to have that essence by now becoming a particular host, by now becoming the body and blood of Christ. And so let's say we have two what questions. Okay, so we have one what question, which is, what is the Eucharistic element pre-consecration? And then another one, what is the Eucharistic element post-consecration? Then what we would have as answers is that pre-consecration, the Eucharistic element is a particular piece of bread. But then post-consecration, the element is a particular host. It is the body, blood of Christ. In short, it is Jesus Christ. And so what we have is a transubstantiation. We have an essential chain or a radical metamorphosis of the Eucharistic element because of the change in essence that takes place there. So I don't know if you have any questions. I was just going on there, but is that good, or would you like me to move on? All right, awesome. So that is the sort of first part of the account. The account has now further precisified the doctrine of transubstantiation to be the case that there is a change to the essence of the Eucharistic element from being something identified as bread to being the body and blood of Christ, the host, and it is now Jesus Christ. And what we have there is a change to the identity, the change to the essence of the element. But then what we have, though, there are a few problems that can be raised now with this specific account. And what I've called it, I don't know if I called it in the paper, what I'm calling it here is the incompleteness problem. Because what we have is, yes, we do have an interesting thing going on here. We do seem to have some transformation taking place here, but I don't think it actually gets us where we want to get to with the doctrine and trying to clarify the meaning of it ontologically. Because what we can say is that the Neo-Aristotelian count at the moment doesn't really do things in the way that we want, because it doesn't firstly tell us how this essential change takes place. It tells us that there is a change to the essence. The real definition is stated in this way. Post-consecration is then stated in another way. But then we don't really know how this happens. How does this take place? But then also, more importantly, I would say, it doesn't provide us with an explanation of how the sensible qualities of bread remain in the element. Like, how are these things still there? Because what we have is a change to the essence of the Eucharistic element from one thing to another. But what you should also say is, well, if we were to ever have an essential change to something, there will always be a change to the qualities of that thing as well. So if we were, for example, to have, let's say it was possible that a human could change to a crocodile, say the essence of a human changes to the essence of a crocodile. Well, if that was to take place, and I was to point to that human or thing that used to be a human and say, no, that thing's a crocodile now, I'm going to say that because I also see that there are sensible qualities that are changed as well. So there should be a changing of my skin to now, the scales or whatever of a reptile. And so what you should have is not just the change of an essence, but a change of the sensible qualities. So if we have an essential change, it seems to be plausible that we should also have a sensible qualities change as well. But we don't want that. We want the sensible qualities remaining within the Eucharistic element, but there being an essential change to it that allows us to say that it is now the body and blood of Christ. But how do we get there? Because the account hasn't provided us with an answer for that. And so what someone could say then is that with these issues in hand, the incompleteness problem, it seems to be the case that either transubstantiation hasn't taken place, because if there is an essential change, there should be a change to the sensible qualities. And so we don't want that, so we shouldn't go with this account. Or we need to do a little bit more philosophical digging. We need to have a further metaphysical explanation for how this essential change takes place and how the sensible qualities can still remain within the Eucharistic element. And so that's what I believe we can do by drawing now on another aspect of Lowe's metaphysics, which is his 4-category ontology. Now, I said before that this is conceptually deep. We're now even going to go even deeper waters when we go into his 4-category ontology. But again, I'm going to break down things, and hopefully that breakdown will help people understand a little bit more.
Yeah.
So
Joshua,
now we're switching.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yes, please.
But in the last slide, there we go.
Yes.
Would the incompleteness problem be kind of like a version of the absence objection as you described in the paper?
It could be.
Okay.
Yes, I think it could be. But this one, I would say, probably can stick. But I don't believe the absence problem later on will actually stick once it's properly understood. Because this one is saying, yeah, there is a change that takes place, but our expectation should be that there shouldn't be any of the remaining of this thing. There shouldn't be, it should be a complete changing of everything, including essence and sensible qualities. And I think that should be the case with the account so far. And so that's why we need to then go on to the ontological issue and trying to utilize his metaphysics to then ward off this maybe objection that will reappear in the absence problem.
All right. Yeah. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. So now just go on to his ontological framework. So Lowe's ontology is sort of formulated within the wider area of something called formal ontology, which is just a study of what exists and what categories are fundamental. So people who are doing ontological work in the formal sense are trying to say, well, what things actually exist? What goes on our list of existing things? And then what categories of things are fundamental? What categories exist and what categories are fundamental within, let's say, reality? And so formal ontology is that specific study. And then one of the pioneers of this sort of field has been Lowe, specifically because he has one of the most robust ontological systems, which again, because of his passing, I would say hasn't blown up in the way that I believe it could, because it clarifies so many things in the metaphysical realm, in the scientific realm, which was his main purpose, but then I believe also in the theological realm as well. And so at the most, let's say, base level of understanding his four-category ontology is that the four-category ontology states that there are four cross-categorial fundamental ontological categories. Now, why they're cross-categories? Because they're dependent upon each other in certain ways. The key thing is that there are four categories that every entity falls within. So anything that exists will fall into one of these four categories. And these categories are the categories of objects, modes, kinds, and attributes. I'm now going to break them all down so people can understand them more clearly. Okay, but just to understand, there are four categories, and Lowe loves to use something called the ontological square to help illustrate this. So we have this ontological square, which captures all of these four categories. And so with that in mind, hopefully people can be looking at the square whilst we're breaking this down, is that we can define these categories as follows. So we have these four categories. And so objects are defined by Lowe as property bearers that are instances of kinds and characterized by modes. So if you look at the ontological square there, you have objects at the bottom left, and they are linked in a certain way to kinds because they are instances of kinds. So you have, for example, let's say you have a tomato, which is a particular object, and that tomato is an object, falls into that category, but then it instantiates a certain kind and it's characterized by a certain mode. Okay, so that's an object. And then a kind is he calls a substantial universal. So he holds the kinds as universals. So they are understood to be universals, but these universals are instantiated by objects, and then they are characterized by attributes. So you have, let's say, the tomato being the object, which then instantiates, let's say, the kind tomato that all tomatoes are falling into. And then that kind tomato is then characterized by an attribute. Okay, so you have these two categories already, objects and kinds, and they're linked together by a relation of instantiation. And objects are characterized by modes and kinds are characterized by attributes. And then you have the category of attributes, which is on the top right. And these are, again, universals. So he has two types of universals in his ontological framework, kinds and attributes. And attributes are what we normally see to be properties. So what we normally see to be universals. So he calls them attributes, and they are instantiated by modes, and they have the role of characterizing kinds. So attributes are linked to kinds by being characterizers of them, and then they are instantiated by modes. So then going with the tomato example, object instantiates the kind tomato, but then the kind itself is then characterized by the universal, let's say, redness. So let's say you have a redness universal that then characterizes the kind tomato, which then every object is then read by being an instance of that kind. So the key thing there is, unlike other philosophers, he sees objects as not being directly related to attributes. They do not instantiate attributes. Objects only instantiate kinds, but then the kinds are the things themselves which then have the attributes being characterizers of them. So they are the things that are directly related to attributes, and those will be kinds. And then you have modes, which are on the bottom right, and these are particularized attributes. So these will be things which I've used in other areas that people might know. They will be tropes. And so you have modes. So in his framework, you have things which are modes as well. So normally you'll have let's say, ontological frameworks, you'll have either universals or you'll have modes / tropes. But Lowe believes, because of the explanatory power that's needed and had by these categories, we should include them within our ontology. And so what you'll have is that modes are just particularized attributes, and they are instances of attributes, the kind attributes, and then their role is to characterize objects. So what you'll have, just going with our example and completing the square, is that you'll have a tomato, which is, let's say I've said already, it instantiates the kind tomato, and then the kind tomato is then characterized by a redness attribute. But then that redness attribute is something which is instantiated by a particular redness mode. But then that redness mode is something which then characterizes the tomato. So the tomato is red because it has the particular mode of redness, which is given to it by a redness mode. But then that redness mode, why it exists is because it exists as something which instantiates the universal of redness. So that universal redness exists because it is instantiated by modes, and then modes play the role of giving us our character. So that tomato has the character being red, not because it instantiates the universal of redness, but because it's characterized by a mode, which is then itself an instance of the universal of redness. So I don't know if there's any clarification need there, or I can.
Yeah. Could you just talk about, I don't know if I don't recall if you did, but the relationship between objects and attributes.
Okay, yeah. So that's actually key. I'm just actually going to go into it now.
Sure. Okay.
So yeah, that preempts this point here. So thank you for that. So how we understand that then, sort of the important one is the relationship between objects and the universal of attributes or category of attributes is by understanding Lowe's definition of relations. So the relations that we can see in the square, they are understood in a certain way. So you have the instantiation relation, and that relation is something that connects objects to kinds, as we can see on the left of the square. And then we also have modes being connected by a relation of instantiation to attributes. So the relation of instantiation, like I've said, does not, as normally understood, connect objects to attributes. It only connects objects to their kinds and modes to their own attributes, or the category of attributes. Then you have the relation of characterization, which then connects modes to objects at the bottom, and then it also connects attributes to kinds. So let's say I have the characteristic of having, let's say, brown skin, because I have a brownness mode, which then characterizes me. And then a kind, so let's say there's a kind, going with the tomato example again to be consistent. So you have the kind tomato, which has the character, the kind itself has the character of being red because it has that character given to it by an attribute which is linked to it by a relation of characterization. But then the key one, and to answer your question, is this relation of exemplification. And this plays a big role in the account that I'm putting forward. So the relation of exemplification, as you can see in the first image, is something which connects an object to the category of attributes. So what you have is the relation of exemplification is understood as a derivative relation. And what that means is because it can be broken down or reduced to the relation of instantiation and characterization. So it's a relation that can be broken down or reduced to these other two more fundamental relations. And so that's why then we can understand it to come in two forms. So Lowe calls this dispositional exemplification and occurrent exemplification. And so I've got an image of the second image at the bottom there, which also helps understand this. So dispositional exemplification is where an object instantiates a kind that is then characterized by an attribute. So you have the object at the bottom left instantiating a kind, which then is characterized by that attribute. And so the object is in a indirect fashion connected to an attribute because it's something that falls into a kind which then has that attribute itself. And that's called dispositional exemplification. So there's sort of a dispositional route, as you can see at the bottom, to the exemplification of the attribute. But then there's a current exemplification, which is the idea that an object is characterized by a mode, which is then an instance of that attribute. So by an object having the character that is given to it by a mode, it then is linked to the category of attributes because that mode is itself an instance of that attribute. And so what you have is then an occurrence route, as you can see in the bottom image, to the exemplification of the attribute by a specific object. So you have these two forms of exemplification which link objects to attributes. You can have the dispositional form, or you can have the occurrent form. Now, I have a star there because in the box, because that's going to play a big role in understanding what we're doing here. Okay, so I'm just going to move on now. So this is sort of laid, the ontology laid out in sort of the most simplest fashion as I can. And then I'm now going to apply it to our case in hand. Now, I'm not going to state the doctrine yet, because that will be formulated at the end. But what I'm going to do is two things. I'm first going to categorize the Eucharistic element within this framework, and then I'm going to explain how the transformation of the Eucharistic element to the body and blood of Christ actually takes place. So the way I'm going to do this is just by doing what we just did, but I'm going to apply it within the context of the Eucharist. So, and I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to break it down further later on. But this is just to state this categorization at the beginning. So we have, let's say, the category of objects. The Eucharistic element is an object. Okay, so it falls into that category. So it's a substance, individual substance. It's a particular object. It falls into the category of objects. But then the key thing is that it's an instance of two kinds. And I've called it the kind bread and the kind host. So that, as we saw before, the tomato is an instance of one kind tomato. Okay, but the Eucharistic element is taken to be an instance of two kinds, the kind bread and kind host. And then the kind bread and host are things which are instances of it. But then also we have the Eucharistic element being characterized by some modes. So we have the element being instance of two kinds, and then it's characterized by some modes, but it'll only be one type of modes, which I've called the B modes. So then looking at the category of kinds, we have two kinds, as I said, that are instantiated. But the key thing here is that the kind bread is instantiated by the Eucharistic element pre-consecration, and then the kind host is instantiated by the Eucharistic element post-consecration. So there's a sequential instantiation of these kinds. They are not instantiated at the same time. It's very important to be understood that they are instantiated at one time, and then the other one's instantiated at the other time. Bread, pre-consecration, and then the kind host, post-consecration. And then we have attributes, and there are two types of attributes that are involved here. What I've called the H attributes are the attributes of the host, so the attributes of being the body and blood of Christ. And those attributes characterize the kind host. But the key thing is that they are not instantiated by any modes that then characterize the Eucharistic element. So these attributes which exist, they are not they characterize the kind, but they themselves are not instantiated by any modes that then characterize the Eucharistic element. But then we have the B attributes, that's the attributes of bread, whatever makes bread what it is, that characterize the kind bread, but they are then instantiated by a set of modes called the B modes or bread modes that characterize the Eucharistic element. So two attributes, one is instantiated by modes, one isn't. And so then we have the category of modes. As I said, there's one set of modes, which are called the B modes, and these are particular attributes of bread. And these characterize the Eucharistic element pre and post consecration, and they provide it with its sensible qualities. So the qualities of bread are had by the Eucharistic element pre-consecration, and they are maintained post-consecration. And then the relations that we do have instantiation and characterization, but the key thing is that we have exemplification. We have dispositional exemplification, and the idea here is that the Eucharistic element pre-consecration instantiates the kind bread, and then post-consecration it only instantiates the kind host that is then characterized by the H attributes. So there's this dispositional exemplification where it's instantiating one kind pre-consecration, and then it instantiates only the kind host post-consecration. And then you have a current exemplification, which links the Eucharistic element to the attributes. And this, what we have here is that the Eucharistic element pre and post is characterized by B modes, which are then instances of the B attributes. So it is going to have an occurrent exemplification pre and post. But dispositional exemplification is had in one way, and then it changes to be being had in another way. Okay, so that's our characterization. I will move on just because now I'm going to break it down better, I would say, which hopefully will help people understand it. So prior to the act of consecration, there are two states of affairs that obtain. So two things that happen. We have a dispositional state of affairs in which the Eucharistic element is dispositionally exemplifying the be attributes. That means prior to the act of consecration, it's instantiating the kind bread, which is characterized by the be attributes. And that means then that it is a bread instance. It's an instance of bread pre-consecration because of its dispositional exemplification. But then also, prior to the act of consecration, there is also an occurrent state of affairs. That is where the element is currently exemplifying the be attribute. So it's being characterized by be modes, which are then instances of the be attributes. So what we can say then is that it's a bread instance and it's charactered as bread prior to the act of consecration. So if we have here with the image, which will hopefully help people understand it better, we have the Eucharistic element, the bottom left, falling into a category of particular objects. And this is pre-consecration. It instantiates the kind bread, which is characterized by bread attributes. And then the bread attributes are instantiated by bread modes, which are then characterizing the Eucharistic element. So what we have is a normal case here. We have the element being bread, and it has the character of bread. Why it has this is because it currently exemplifies bread attributes, and it dispositionally does this as well. But the important thing is that in its pre-consecration state, the Eucharistic element is not instantiating the kind host, and it's not characterized by any H modes at all. It is just simply a particular piece of bread. That's all it is pre-consecration. And so like I was speaking about the tomato, we say the same thing about the elements in the way that it is bread. Everything's normal, falls into the kind bread, charactered as bread, dispositionally and currently exemplifies the attributes of being bread. And so let's say we have a what question. Let's say you have a child that says, mommy, daddy, what is that thing on the, on the altar? And if we're talking pre-consecration, the right answer will be, well, the Eucharistic element is just simply a particular piece of bread. That's what it is right there at that specific point in time. So we have an answer, given its essence, it's just a particular piece of bread. Okay. Now then, moving on to the important change that takes place. So this is the transformation that we're trying to capture. What we see then is that at the moment of consecration, we see a change that takes place. But the best way to understand this essential change, which I termed it before, is a change that I call a kind change. It's a change to the kind that is being instantiated. That's the key thing that happens here. Because what we have is something which is a change that's understood in two ways. We have something that occurs, which is a new dispositional state of affair that obtains. That is, at the moment of consecration, the Eucharistic element is now dispositionally exemplifying the H attributes. So the attributes of the host, which are characterizing the kind host, it's now linked to the Eucharistic element, because the Eucharistic element now becomes a host instance. It now instantiates the kind host, which then is characterized by the attributes of being the body and blood of Christ. But then also another thing happens, there's a transformation or change that takes place, is that there is now a dispositional state of affairs that fails to obtain, which is that of the Eucharistic element now failing to dispositionally exemplify the be attributes. So we don't have now a dispositional exemplification of any bread attributes by the Eucharistic element. So post-consecration, the Eucharistic element is dispositionally a host, and it now has ceased to dispositionally be bread. So it's now solely a hosted instance, and it's not an instance of the kind bread anymore. And so the important point now for this in its post-consecrated state is that the Eucharistic element is even though it's now changed in its exemplification, it's now dispositionally exemplifying the H attributes and not the B attributes. The important key thing here is that it's still being characterized by B modes. And so these B modes are then instances of the B attributes. So what we can then say is that the Eucharistic element is still a currently bread. It is charactered as bread. And so this then accounts for it having the sensible qualities of bread. It has the characteristic of bread because it has all of the B modes which are giving it that character. It's characterized by these B modes. And so what we need to understand, though, and hopefully there's no misunderstanding here, is that even though we have a current exemplification of the B attributes, but not a dispositional one, we have a true change that takes place here, because it is the dispositional exemplification of the B attributes which make the Eucharistic element what it is. The particular object that it is identified by what kind it is instantiating. And what kind it is instantiating post-consecration is that of the kind host and not the kind bread. So what it is now a particular host. It is a host instance only. And so, as I was saying before, the existence of the B modes provide the element with its character. Why it's characterized and looks and we can sense it to be bread and have the appearance of bread is because it has these B modes. But it is not a particular piece of bread anymore because it fails to fall into the kind bread, which provides it with its existence and identity conditions. And so if we have that child again now pointing and saying to its parent, let's say it's post-consecration now, and so I say, what is the element now? What is it? And it asks us what question? Well, the correct answer would be to say, well, it is the host. It is the body and blood of Jesus Christ. It is a host instance in a more philosophically clear way. And so despite it appearing to our senses as bread, it looks and feels and tastes like bread, what it is, that is its essence, its identity is Jesus Christ, though what it is charactered as is as a particular piece of bread. So there's that distinction there, what it is and what it is charactered as. What it is Christ because of its dispositional exemplification, its instantiation of the kind host. But what it's charactered as is as a particular piece of bread because of its B mode characterization. So just sort of the last points on this, just to help illustrate what's happened here. What we have post-consecration is now a split exemplification, where the Eucharistic element is now solely instantiating the kind host, and thus dispositionally exemplifies the H attributes. And so what we have is a dispositional root for the elements exemplifying the H attributes. So we have the Eucharistic element, as we can see in the top images, instantiating the kind host, which is characterized by the H attributes. And so it exemplifies the attributes that make it the body and blood of Christ by it falling into that kind. And so there's a dispositional exemplification. But then at the same time, in this post-consecrated state, what we have is that the Eucharistic element is solely charactered by some B modes. It doesn't have any host modes. That's why we don't taste and see the body and blood of Christ, because the modes that characterize it, give it its features, are things which are the B modes, and they are instances of the B attributes. And so what we have then is a current root for the elements exemplifying the B attributes post-consecration. Now, something that might be interesting, I didn't bring this up in the paper, is that some people might have an objection, which we can call maybe the mystery objection, or actually probably a better thing is the miracle objection. You still want to have the Eucharist being a miracle. Okay, you don't want it now to hey, we can just utilize this really cool ontology to now understand the Eucharist completely. No, we want it to be a mystery in a way, and we want it to be miraculous. Well, that's actually can be captured very well here, because you don't find split exemplifications of anything. Things are currently and dispositionally exemplify attributes in that way. Things normally only have one let's say, fundamental kind that they fall into. They don't have two. So what we have here is, yes, God has performed a miracle. He has performed the split exemplification, which doesn't occur in the normal course of things. And we have this thing now have a sequential instantiation of kinds without it going completely out of existence. And so what we seem to have here is this miracle also being in play. And we can have that with this split exemplification. So with all of that sort of nitty-gritty ontology and metaphysics, we can now reach a philosophically heavy, precise definition of the doctrine of transubstantiation. So obviously you won't say this to your children, hey guys, this is the way that we can understand transubstantiation. No, you can capture it exactly in the simple statement that we had at the beginning, or the precise statement that we had at the beginning. That's the way we understood it. That's the way the church has understood it. But then if you want to get a little bit more metaphysically heavy and say, well, how does this work? Well, this is a more precise, I would say philosophically accurate definition given by this interpretation. So at the moment of consecration, Jesus Christ is substantially present in the propertied form of the H attributes within the Eucharistic element, through this individual substance ceasing to dispositionally exemplify the B attributes. And thus it's ceasing to have an essence of bread and be a bread instance. And also beginning to dispositionally exemplify the H attributes. And thus it beginning to have an essence of a host by becoming a host instance. So that's a very, very long sentence. But what we have is these propertied attributes are within the Eucharistic elements, which we can call a substance. And why it's there is because there is a ceasing, firstly, of it having the B attributes in this dispositional form. And then there is now a beginning of its having this H attributes in a dispositional fashion. And so then after this conversion, the Eucharistic element continues to have sensible qualities of bread, as this conversion does not result in a cessation of the current exemplification of the B attributes by it through the characterization by some B modes, which provide it with its character. So just sort of in a more clearer sense, after this conversion, we have the sensible qualities of bread, because even though there has been a transformation, a transubstantiation, a conversion, we still have the maintenance of the current exemplification of the B attributes. We still have the B modes characterizing the Eucharistic element. That hasn't stopped. All that has changed is that there is a change to its dispositional exemplification. There is one kind that it used to instantiate, and then after the act of consecration, it then instantiates another kind. And that's what makes it what it is. It makes it the body and blood of Christ. And so that's the definition. That's the model that I will count I'm putting forward. And so I'm putting forward an account that draws from the work of Lowe, and I'm trying to extend it within this context. And I believe you can have that answer to this intelligibility question, because what ontologically is happening here? Well, there is simply a kind change, an essential change. That's all that happens. That's all I'm saying. There's a change to the kinds that are instantiated, and it's a sequential change. But what's maintained is the sensible qualities understood as the B modes. They are still characterizing the Eucharistic element. And that's why we can still sense it to be bread, even though what it is the body and blood of Christ. Because what makes it what it is its essence expressed by a real definition. But then how we understand an essence is determined by the kind of that thing. So when there's a kind change, there's an essential change, but we still have this maintenance of the sensible qualities. So yeah, then that's the model sort of mapped out. And I don't know if you want to jump in or anything before we might maybe map out the objections quickly.
Yeah, I just want to say two things. I think the first is that just given my background understanding, just reading from the Summa and just commentators on Aquinas, right? What you've given forward, I think, is actually just a more precise kind of contemporary articulation of what St. Thomas and the councils have said. And so I really appreciate that, because now having you walk me through it, I think it was easier for me to understand. And the second thing I wanted to mention too, so then with that first point, I'm just wondering, do you feel like there's anything new in terms, I think what you've basically done is just kind of updated the terminology and made it even more precise. I don't think you're trying to do anything like terribly novel in any other respect with the doctrine. You're just trying to preserve the orthodoxy of it. but using our language today. And the second thing is that just a humorous story. I read this part of the paper to my priest, and my priest kind of looked at me like, "What the heck are you talking about?" And like, it was just really funny. But yeah, I mean, if your child can understand this when they ask the question, that would be pretty epic. So I'd love to see a Catholic father read out this. And I'm kidding. But yeah, Joshua, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's very true, and I think that's with all of my work. You're like, what the hell is going on here? Yeah, I would agree with you, and this is something that's been brought up quite a lot with other things that I've been working on. And yeah, my purpose for things is not to bring up like a completely new idea that that hasn't been thought of before, because the first thing that I think I learned when I started learning about theology is the new is not necessarily the good. That's not the way we should be operating, because revelation was given to us 2,000 years ago, and we want to have fidelity towards revelation as expressed, I would say, as a Catholic, by the magisterium, the teaching of the church. And so we don't want new things that have been thought of before, because number one, there might be a reason why they haven't been thought of, not because of our conceptual categories being new, but maybe because they, when thought through properly, would lead to a theological problem or heresy or something like that. So you do want something that's grounded in the history of the church, the teaching of the church. And so just utilizing new words or new concepts to explicate in a let's say a more precise fashion what the church has taught is something I want to do. That's my real desire. So yeah, I'm happy that there will be, let's say some linking with the work of St. Thomas Aquinas and others on this issue, because that's what I want to do. I'll want to Aquinas to say, yeah, thumbs up, this is all right. Not, no, there's problems. Because if Aquinas is saying there's problems, more likely there's problems. So yeah, I mean, if it does sort of explicate what the church has taught in a different, with different language and things like that, that's something I definitely want to be doing. But yeah, I would say with that sort of simplicity aspect of explaining it, just really what I'm saying is that there's a change to what that thing is. At one point it was something, and then another point it was something else, but there is a remaining of its qualities, and the way we understand that is the character it has. And that's sort of the simplest way of stating it. But then when people are saying, well, asking deeper, well, what do you mean by what it is? Then you'll say, oh, well, it's essence. There's a change to its essence. Well, what do you mean by the essence? And blah, blah, blah. Then you start speaking about the kind and all those sort of things. So you can always, like those sort of Russian dolls that you can open up and get more layers as you go deeper in. Yeah, that's how it is, I think, with this thing. You state it in the most simple fashion, but then the questions, when they're more philosophically robust, you'll want to then provide a more philosophically robust answer to them. Yeah. Okay.
All right. I think I'm ready to hear some objections, Joshua.
Yeah. So these are some objections, and there will be many more objections that people can raise, but these are the ones I tackled in the paper. And so I'm just going to really briefly go through them. I'm not going to go in depth at all. So if people want to sort of see a more worked out answer, please do refer to the paper. But yeah, so there were 4 objections that I called. The first one was persistence objection, the absence objection, the presence objection, and property objection. Hopefully they're in the same order as the paper. I'm not 100% certain if they are. But yeah, just walking through them, we have the persistence objection. So I'm just going to read exactly as it states there, and then sort of flesh out the response. So the NA account, which is the Neo-Aristotelian account, posits an essential kind change to the Eucharistic elements. However, there does not seem to be a persisting entity that experiences this change in essence, or from one kind to another kind. However, without there being a persisting entity, there doesn't seem to be a way for there to be a transformation that takes place at the moment of consecration, as there is nothing that experiences this transformation. So most simplest fashion is, what is persisting through the change that takes place here? We have a change of the essence of one thing to another thing. But what is actually there? What underlies it? Because there seems to be a change, but there needs to be something that is changing. So what is it? Because it can't be bread that is changing to being bread again, because what you have is a substance that used to be bread that then is now substantially something else. So what is that thing that we're referring to that has that change to essence and its kind? Well, my response is that this can be dealt with in 2 ways. So what I've called it, and I don't think I called it there in the paper, but I'm calling the Lowean option. So that's following E.J. Lowe. So E.J. Lowe spoke about this sort of thing in a different context, but I've applied it here. And if people do want to follow it up, it's not in his 4-category ontology book. It's in another book called The Possibility of Metaphysics, where he speaks about this type of thing occurring. So if people want to look it up. So I've called the first one the Lowian option, and the second one the Armstrongian option. So that's following David Armstrong, so a very famous philosopher. So utilizing some of his ideas, we can deal with this objection. So in the most basic sense, the Lowian option to deal with this problem of what is a persisting entity is that the change that occurs is instantaneous. So what we have a change to the essence of the thing. So we have one thing changing in the essence and kind to another thing of a different essence of kind. What we have is that we don't need to posit any persisting entity because there is no temporal gap between the changes. There is just something that happens instantaneously. So it's not like there's 1 second and then 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and then the fourth second, there is now a change. Now, at the moment of consecration, there is an instantaneous change from one thing being substantially one way to being substantially another way. So there is no need to posit a persisting entity. Now, that's one way that someone could take it. Someone might say, well, how do you make sense of instantaneous changes? Are there things that have instantaneous changes? And also an interesting thing is, because I always bring up Swinburne in loads of my works, he didn't play a part in this, but let's say, for example, someone who affirms things about Swinburne sees things as taking place over periods of time. So even things that change instantaneously, they require certain periods of time. So there will be a period that you'll call an instance. So there'll need to be something that is existing within that period, even if it is only for an instance. So someone might have a problem with that. How do we make sense of instantaneous change? So if you don't like that option, I've provided the other option, which again, David Armstrong, being an atheist, would not have cared less about this doctrine. But I've sort of mined his work and utilized an idea here. So what you could say is that there is a bare particular that experiences a change. So you have the Eucharistic element, which we can call a bare particular, which in one moment is this thing which we call bread. And then at the moment of consecration, it experiences essential change, kind change, and then becomes the body and blood of Christ. And then what is the thing that's changing is the thing underlying that. Now, a lot of philosophers don't like the term bare particular. It's something that a lot of people walk away from. But the key thing when it comes to Armstrong is that he doesn't mean bare particular in the sense of an entity that exists without instantiating anything. What he means is that entities can be understood to be thin and thick particulars. So let's say you have the Eucharistic element when it's bread, that is it existing as a thick particular. It is this something instantiating something else. So you have the universal kind that instantiates, and then that's brought together with the Eucharistic element. And then the Eucharistic element is just the thing that we refer to when we mentally extract the universal that it is instantiating. Whatever the thing is instantiating at universal, we're just extracting it mentally. So that's what he means. So what we have then is just that what's experiencing the change is a thin particular, which at one moment was in one way, and in another moment is in another way. And so there is something existing, but the only way that we can extract it is in a mental fashion. That's all that's happening. And so you could go with that option as well. In the paper, I didn't choose which option. And so people, again, might not like or might not be able to conceive of what a thick and thin particulars are. They might not be in people's ontology. And an interesting thing is the Armstrongian option was not at all affirmed by Lowe. Lowe did not like bare particulars in any fashion. So Lowe wouldn't have gone with that idea. But whichever one you want to take, I believe it deals with the problem because it allows us to affirm that there is a transformation to something. Either the Armstrongian option allows us to say the thin particular is a thing that's transforming, or we don't even need to posit any persisting entity because the change is just instantaneous. There's no period of time where there needs to be something that's underlying the change that takes place. So someone could go with that. Yeah, so that's my response to that objection. Okay, then with the absence objection, just stating this, I'm actually not going to read out all of this. It's just a lot of text, but if people want to read it, they can. But the absence of objection is just the idea when there is a change to the Eucharistic element at the moment of consecration, there is supposed to be something remaining within the thing. There is supposed to be something remaining within. So what we are trying to say is that there should be the character that's remaining within the Eucharistic element. So we have the Eucharistic element at the moment of consecration. What's remaining is the sensible qualities. But the problem that we have, someone might say, is if we conceive of these sensible qualities to be B modes, so modes, particular modes, so we can say the particular water that makes the bread, the particular flour, and all these sort of things. If we say these things are the things that characterize the Eucharistic element, then how can we not say that it's still bread? Because at the end of the day, what makes something bread is its characteristics. So if we take these things to be modes that are had by the Eucharistic element, then we don't seem to have a real absence, because we want to have a real absence of bread from the Eucharistic element. It doesn't have any bread within it anymore. But then if we take these sensible qualities to be modes, which are characterizing the Eucharistic element, we seem to still have bread there, because what makes bread are its characteristics. So it seems to be the case, if we interpret the sensible qualities as B modes, then we're not really going to have the real absence which is needed in order to affirm the doctrine in place here. So, okay, the way I respond to this in the paper, and this is something that those who might have followed my other work would be familiar with, is that you can, in the contemporary field of metaphysics, you can draw a distinction between different types of modes. Now, in the other context that I bring this up, I refer to them as tropes, but we're just talking about the same thing here. So I'll use the term tropes just because it's utilized by other philosophers. So you can draw a distinction between tropes in a modifier sense and a module sense. Now, modifier tropes are properties that are had by a entity which are non-self-exemplifying. So when they characterize the particular entity that we want it to characterize, that thing does not have the character that it gives to the thing itself. But then module tropes are different. They are not actually properties, they are objects which are self-exemplifying. So they give the character that they themselves have. So they give to the thing thing that they themselves have. So what we want to say then, okay, maybe an illustration can help you. So in other contexts, I've used the example, let's say, of a hotness trope. So when I burn my hand by touching something hot, what is burning my hand is the module trope of the hotness trope, because let's say I touch a stove and I burn my hand, that thing is made up of loads of tropes. One of the tropes that it has is a hotness trope, which we can understand to be modular, because the reason why I'm burning my hand is because the hotness trope has interacted with my hand. And so the hotness trope is hot itself. And so that's why I'm burning my hand. But then an example of a modifier trope could be a thing like a weight trope. If there is a trope that makes something have a certain weight, it itself doesn't weigh anything. What we actually put on the scale is the object that we're putting on the scale. It's not the tropes themselves. So the tropes are not things that have weight themselves. They are things which give weight when they're together, and maybe together they make something 2 kilograms, but they themselves are not, let's say, 1 gram, 1 gram, 1 gram. We add them all together and they make up, let's say, 2 kg. So modified tropes are things which give what they do not have. Module tropes are things which give what they already possess. And this is really key. Now, it's not so important understanding the other aspects, properties, and particular objects, which are more important in other contexts. But the key thing is about self-exemplification in this context. Now, the way we can understand this then is that the B modes which characterize the Eucharistic elements can be best understood as modifier tropes. Why we should do that is because if you look at the ontology, the ontological framework, is that modes are taken to be particular attributes. They are taken to be properties, particular properties. And so they are not objects. So they would not be able to do anything in a characterizing role. Only particular properties or attributes in this four-category ontology can fulfill the role of categorizing something else. So it will be a category mistake to actually say the things that make the Eucharistic element what they are, the B modes, are module tropes, because module tropes are particular objects. So they must be modifier tropes. But then if they are modifier tropes, they do not have any of the character that they give to the Eucharistic element. So they are not self-exemplifying. So they do not have the character of breadness. So they make the Eucharistic elements appear and sense, we can sense it to be bread, but they are not things that make it bread in the sense that they are, let's say, the flour and all these sort of things put together remaining within there. They just give it its character without themselves having that character. So what was the mistake, I think, with this objection, if someone was to raise it, is to take the view that the Eucharistic element is made up of loads of modifier tropes, these particular objects, which are brought together in a compresent bundle that make up the Eucharistic elements and make it bread. That would be the objection actually sticking here, because yes, if there are module tropes that make up the Eucharistic elements, then if it still has those module tropes, then it must still be bread, because module tropes have the character that they are bestowing upon the particular object. Mm-hmm. But if they're modifier tropes, they don't have that character. They just give what they don't have. So they give the character without themselves having that character. So even if there are modifier tropes remaining within the Eucharistic element, it doesn't mean that the things that make it bread are also remaining as well, even though it has that character bestowed upon it.
Okay. Yeah, would this be, Joshua, would this be something like, take like the bundle theory on essence, right? Where basically they say like, hey, if you have this bundle of properties, then that's enough to give you the essence. But then you're like, well, what unifies all those bundles into, or those properties into one? And it's like, there's a kind of a mistake that's going on here in that respect. Is that a good analogy?
Yeah, that would be. And so, and the key thing as well is that Lowe never recognized module tropes. So they were not part of his ontology. So even what I'm saying here would fit with what Lowe's saying, because he rejected bundle theory. Yeah. Because he believed we had to have a substance ontology where there are particular objects that instantiate things, right? Not these bundles of tropes. So he did not recognize module tropes. But he never used the terminology, but he would have recognized modifier tropes in the sense that I'm speaking about. And he would say, yeah, they are my modes that are part of this ontological framework. So it fits with exactly what Lowe is saying, just utilizing this distinction. And so, by utilizing the distinction, we can say, yes, it has this character, but it is still not bread because it doesn't have the things that make it bread. What makes it what it is its instantiation of its kind. And that's all that we need to say.
Yeah. Brilliant.
Okay, awesome. Okay, just moving on quickly then to the presence objection. I will read this one just because this one is actually a weighty objection. Okay, so the Neo-Aristotelian account takes the Eucharistic elements to only dispositionally be Jesus Christ. One could ask, however, if a construal of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist in this specific way, that is a dispositional way, renders the presence of Christ as a mere potentiality rather than an actuality, then Christ is not really present in the Eucharist. He's only potentially present. So the key thing here is, if we take, and this is an objection, which actually, when the paper was going through the review process, was one of the things that was brought up. But I did address it prior to that. But they brought this up and said, actually, thank you, because when people first hear the word disposition, they think of the potentiality to do something. I have a disposition to be, for example, nice. Doesn't necessarily mean I'm actually being nice at that specific time. I just can be nice if I want to be. I have that disposition towards it, or an inclination. So you have the idea of a potentiality. That's what someone has. So if we say the Eucharist is only dispositionally the body and blood of Christ, someone might say, we're just saying it's potentially that thing, but it's not actually that thing. And so what it actually is just bread. And that will be the problem. So someone could say, we don't really have the real presence there. We just have something that should at some point hopefully become the real presence because it has a disposition, but it not actually is. That's what someone might say. So we seem to have a problem here. Now, as I said, this is an important objection, but what I think it's predicated upon is a misconception of the nature of dispositionality in this specific ontological framework. Because it's wrong to understand dispositionality to mean that an entity potentially is something or can be something or can do something. That's not what dispositionality means here. It's not about potentiality. It's not about potentially being something or doing something, as we might use that term. And so it doesn't mean, and so it's wrong to understand that when we say that the Eucharistic element is dispositionally Jesus Christ, that it is only potentially the body and blood of Christ. That's not what I'm saying in this specific account. The right way to understand dispositionality is just simply as one way in which an object can be connected to an attribute, i.e. a particular object instantiating some kind which is characterized by certain attributes. So when we're using the term dispositionality in the context of Christ, what we're saying is that the Eucharistic element instantiates the kind host, which is essentially characterized by the attributes which are essential for being Jesus Christ. So the kind host has these attributes which are characterizing it. And so we're connected to these attributes, or the Eucharistic elements connected to it, by simply being an instance of that kind. So we're not saying anything about potentiality. That's not what this at all is trying to say. It's just a misconception or misunderstanding of the terminology. And Lowe used the dispositional or current distinction, not again to actually say something is potentially something or actually something. He was just trying to, I don't really know why he used that terminology, but I think it was to bring clarity to the powers debate that people are having, because powers are normally understood to be dispositions and things like that. But in our context, it's not wholly helpful because we're not saying potentiality. We're saying dispositionality just means that something is instantiating a kind, which then is characterized by that attribute. So it's just one way of being connected to the attribute. That's all it is, but it's not talking about potentiality. Okay. All right. So this will be then, the last objection. So what we have here, and I will read this one. So we have the objection stating that the Neo-Aristotelian account proposed here takes Jesus's body and blood to be present in a propertied form, i.e. the collection of attributes or properties of his body and blood are present in the Eucharist. Hence, this account does not posit the literal presence of Christ in the Eucharistic element, but only that of the presence of a collection of properties within it. We do not have an account here that fits with the biblical narrative and the position of Catholics who adhere to the real and thus literal presence of Christ in the Eucharist. So someone might say, well, what we have here is not really Christ being the Eucharist. This is not Jesus Christ. All we're talking about here are just some properties that are exemplified by the Eucharistic element. But that's not Christ. What we want is the real flesh and blood of Christ here in the Eucharist. Well, why I would say I wanted to tackle this objection is because it actually highlights a connection between someone's view on the Eucharist and someone's view on the doctrine of the Incarnation. Because there is a distinction that can be drawn in the contemporary literature on the doctrine of the Incarnation between something called the concretist view and something called the abstractist view. So the concretist view is the idea that Jesus' human nature, so it's normally in reference to his human nature is a concrete, particular, part-whole thing. So when we say that Christ assumed a nature, what we are saying is that he took on, in some certain sense, a real flesh and bloodied thing, okay? Something that has real flesh and real blood. And so normally you'll have people like Brian Leftow and Oliver Crisp who have taken this view where there will be a sort of a compositional, incarnational understanding that what happened was that Christ, prior to the incarnation, when he was living, he was existing in a certain sense, and then he assumes a human nature, but his assumption of a human nature is him entering into a part-whole relation with a soul and with a body. So the soul that is Christ then gets joined together with a real soul and a real human soul and a real human body. So that's what the human nature is. It's a part-whole, concrete, particular thing. But then the abstractist view, which has been affirmed by people like Alvin Plantinga, and Richard Swinburne and Thomas Morris and a few other people, is the idea that Jesus' human nature is a collection of abstract properties that are necessary and sufficient for being human. So when Christ, being a soul, took on a human nature, he did not enter into a part-whole relation with a human soul and the human body. What his assumption was that he took on certain properties that are necessary and sufficient for being human. So it might be the property of being rational, of being an animal, or other things that make us humans. He just took on these properties, and that's what made him a true human. And so there's a distinction and divide between these, and there's debate between which one's the correct conception. Some people will even say you can hold to both. So you'll have people like Andrew Lowe, who would affirm actually that it's more of a semantic issue than an ontologically real issue. But then you'll have other philosophers who have pushed back on him and said, actually, no, there is a distinction to drawn here. But going with the traditional understanding that there is an ontological distinction here, I believe that what happens is, with this objection, there was a false assumption of the concretist view. That actually, when we say Christ took on, the Son took on a human nature, what we mean is that he took on, a concrete particular. He entered into this part-whole relation with it. And so, yes, if the Eucharist is understood to be Christ's body and blood becoming literally present in the Eucharistic element, then it seems to be the case that we need to have something more than just properties there. It needs to be some flesh and blood thing that maybe, we can't sense it, but it is there in a flesh and, concrete fashion. But that will be taking the concretist view, which I believe one doesn't have to take. Because if one takes the abstractist view, then yes, we can say that Christ is literally present in the Eucharistic element, because his properties, the properties of his being a body and being blood, are exemplified by the Eucharistic element, by the Eucharistic element instantiating the kind host, which then is characterized by the properties that are necessary and sufficient for being the human nature of Christ. So if we conceive of the incarnation in an abstractist sense, then yes, we can take there to be the human body of Christ being literally present in the Eucharist, because all we need to conceive of them is the human nature are a set of properties, collection of properties, and not some concrete particular. So what I was saying is it identifies someone's let's say assumption of their view of the Eucharist and of the incarnation. If you view the Eucharist in this fashion, then there needs to be maybe a link between a consistent link between an abstractist view instead of a concretist view. But this is something that can be thought of later. Just, I believe that it's an assumption that was made that fuels this objection, but you can take another view which allows someone to actually affirm this in the fullest sense. So yeah, I think that is, if I'm correct, I think I've made my way through the main objections. So yeah, that's a presentation done. So hopefully people were able to follow who are going to watch this, and hopefully that was fine for you, Swan. But yeah, I was just trying my best to lay out the metaphysical view that I'm assuming, saying that the doctrine, so this is not talking about the veracity of the doctrine in any fashion. I'm not trying to say, I'm trying to show this doctrine to be true or convince someone to say, actually, yeah, the real presence is true and transubstantiation is true. But it's trying to say, actually, assuming the correctness of our sources of authority, that Christ is speaking about a literal and real presence here, and assuming the interpretation that's given to us by the conciliar declarations, then we can make sense of this in an intelligible fashion so that we can affirm it epistemically and feel confident about it, it being coherent. And then we can also effectively communicate it. Now, obviously, you might not be breaking down and getting your chart out and saying, this is the ontological square. Yeah. But I mean, we just simply say that, yes, there is a change here that takes place, a real change to the essence of the elements, where it becomes the body and blood of Christ, when it used to be, the essence of it used to be that of bread. And what we still see are the sensible qualities, which are just simply its characteristics. And that's all we're saying. But it doesn't mean that it is still that thing. Yeah.
All right, Dr. Joshua Sijuwade, thank you so much for coming on to my show. I found your presentation very helpful, and I think, I'll be going back and, listening to it again, and I'm sure that this will open up a great conversation. And Joshua, I'm sure right now it's almost dinner time for you, so yes. I want to let you get to dinner. So I will talk to you later, my friend.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for having me. And yes, been a blessing. Thank you. Take care.